In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one thing that will tell you what silence sounds like to him: dying. Not the clean kind, the slow kind, where your nerves scream for input and get nothing, and every second without sound is another second your brain tries to eat itself alive. Silence is a wound that does not clot. So he doesn't start with the killing. He starts with the silence. Because that's the thing that made him. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story begins with a boy called Grethis Mund, 14 years old, crouched in the dark of sub-level 38 of Hive Dessicara after the power failed. Singing 4 looping notes his mother used to hum at the loom press, pushing the melody through his teeth to keep the panic from climbing up his throat. He was singing when they came for him. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. You want to know what silence sounds like to me? It sounds like dying, not the clean kind, not the last bolt through the skull that switches everything off in a blink. The other kind, the slow kind, the kind where your nerves are screaming for input and getting nothing, and every second that passes without sound is another second your brain tries to eat itself alive. Silence is a wound that does not clot. So when someone asks me what it is like to be what I am, I do not start with the killing. I do not start with the sonic blasters, or the Doom Sirens, or the 10,000 years of war that turned us into what we are. I start with the silence, because that is the thing that made me. I was singing when they came for Grethis Mund. Not well, not with any particular grace. I was 14 standard years old, crouching inside a drainage conduit in sub-level 38 of Hive Dessicara. And I was singing because the power had failed 6 hours earlier, and the dark was absolute. The song was something my mother used to hum while she worked the loom press in Factorum 19. I did not know the words. She never taught me the words. It was just a melody, 4 notes looping over and over, and I was pushing it through my teeth to keep the panic from climbing up my throat and choking me. The bombardment had started that morning. We did not know what was hitting us. The Vox networks went dead first, then the lumens, then the water recyclers. Sub-level 38 was worker habitation, 4,000 souls packed into a corridor system, designed for maybe 800. When the first shock waves hit, the ceiling in Block Ven collapsed and killed 60 people in the time it takes to sneeze. My mother was not among them. She had been on shift at the Factorum. I never found out what happened to her. That is not a dramatic statement. I mean it literally. Whatever killed her, wherever it happened, it was simply one death among millions. And nobody kept records of it, and I never went back to look. I was singing in the dark, and I was alone. The rest of the drainage conduit's occupants had fled upward toward the middle hive when the second round of bombardment started. I had gone down instead, because down felt safer, which tells you something about how much a 14-year-old boy understands about orbital weapons platforms. And I was singing because the silence in between the impacts was worse than the impacts themselves. I remember that very clearly. The impacts were thunder and metal and the deep structural groan of a hive city being taken apart layer by layer. And they were terrifying. But they were something. They were sensation. My ears could work with them. But the gaps between impacts, those stretches of 5, 10, 20 seconds of nothing, those were the real horror. In those gaps you could hear the settling of rubble, the distant popping of overloaded power couplings, the last wet sounds of people buried under things they would never crawl out from under, and your own breathing, and your own heartbeat, and the blood moving through your own skull. The sound of yourself alone in the dark, waiting for the next blow. I did not know it at the time, but I was auditioning. The Emperor's children had come to Grethis Mund, not for territory, not for strategic value, not for resources. Grethis Mund was a middling hive world in the Cruenta subsector, producing cheap textiles and lower-grade hull plating for Imperial Navy tenders. Its garrison was 3 regiments of planetary defense force that had not fired a shot in anger in 40 years. Its orbital defenses were 2 weapons platforms that had been listed as pending maintenance since before I was born. They came for us, for the population, specifically for the ones who could hear. They test worlds. When a warband of the Emperor's children descends on a world, there are always those among them who listen beneath the screaming and the explosions. They listen for the ones who hear differently, the ones whose auditory cortices process sound with an unusual fidelity, the ones who, when left in absolute darkness with nothing but terror for company, choose to sing. His name was Draeven Korr, and he was the one who found me. I did not hear him approach. That, in itself, was remarkable, because by that point my ears were doing the work of every other sense I had. I was blind in that conduit. My skin was numb from the cold. My nose had long since stopped registering the copper chemical stink of ruptured pipes. My ears were everything. I could hear the tick of cooling metal in the walls. I could hear the resonance signature of the conduit itself, the way my voice bounced differently depending on which direction I faced. I had been mapping the space around me by ear for hours without realizing I was doing it. And I did not hear Draeven Korr until he was close enough to touch me. What I heard instead was a hum, not from him, from his armor. Power armor, I would later learn, vibrates at a specific frequency, depending on the model, the modification, the state of its power core. Draeven Korr wore Mark IV plate, ancient even then, and it hummed at a frequency that sat just below the threshold of normal human hearing. Most people would not have registered it. I heard it as clearly as a bell, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever encountered because it was complex. It was not a single note. It was a chord, 3 or 4 frequencies layered on top of each other, produced by the interaction of servos and ceramite and power couplings and the faint whine of a reactor that had been burning for longer than my entire world had existed. It was alive. It was intricate. And it was coming from inside the darkness. I stopped singing. I turned toward the sound, and a hand the size of my torso closed around my arm and lifted me off the ground as if I were made of paper. He did not speak, not then. He carried me, one-handed, through the conduit system, up through the collapsing sublevel, past the bodies and the rubble and the fires, out through a breach in the hive wall that opened onto a sky I did not recognize. It was purple, and not the purple of any sunset I had grown up under. The sky above Grethis Mund had torn open like a wound, and through it poured light that was not light, colors that had no names, and a sound with no source, vast and shapeless and hungry, that came from the tear itself. Every human being on the surface of Grethis Mund was screaming. Some of them were on fire. Some of them were being herded toward dropships by figures in armor that hurt to look at. Armor that was too bright, too detailed, painted in pinks and purples and golds that seemed to shift and writhe. Some of them were simply standing still, staring up at the sky with their mouths open, and something was leaking from their eyes and ears that was not blood. Not quite. Draeven Korr set me down on the rock-crete apron of a landing platform, where 2 other children were already sitting. One was maybe 12. The other was maybe 16. Both of them were crying. I was not. I was listening to the sky. I remember him looking down at me. His helmet was off. His face was, I want to say it was beautiful, but that is not the right word. It was refined, stripped down to essentials. Cheekbones like knife edges, skin so pale it was almost translucent, and beneath it you could see the faint blue tracery of veins. His eyes were the wrong color, not a color eyes should be, something between violet and silver, and they moved too fast, tracking things I could not see. His ears were modified. I could see that even then, even at 14, with no understanding of what I was looking at. The outer ear was larger than it should have been, sculpted into something that was part flesh and part something else, something that caught sound the way a satellite dish catches signals. He said one thing to me. His voice was low, and it had a texture to it that I had never heard in a human voice before. A secondary vibration underneath the words, as if his vocal cords were producing two sounds simultaneously. He said, "You hear it, don't you?" Not a question. I nodded. He turned and walked away, and that was the last time he was kind to me. They took 37 children from Grethis Mund. I learned later that the warband had tested over 9,000 before selecting us. The testing was simple. A noise marine would stand in a room with the subject and activate a sonic emitter at a frequency just below the threshold of standard human hearing. If the subject reacted, they were taken. If they did not, they were released back into the general population, which by that point meant released into the screaming, burning chaos of a world being stripped for slaves and resources. I do not know which group had the worse fate. I suppose that depends on your definition of worse. The 37 of us were taken aboard a strike cruiser called the Resonant Abyss. It was a vessel that had been in service since the heresy, 10,000 years of continuous operation, and it had grown. That is the only word that fits. The corridors were not entirely metal anymore. The walls had texture, ridged and furrowed like the inside of a throat. The air tasted of something that was not air, and the ship hummed, constantly. A deep bone-level vibration that I could feel in my joints, in my skull, in the fluid behind my eyes. 11 of the 37 did not survive the first week. Their bodies rejected the initial chemical preparations that preceded the gene seed implantation. The chirurgeon, a creature named Heth Necrolus, who wore the flayed face of another apothecary over his own like a surgical mask, removed them from their restraints when they died and took them somewhere deeper into the ship. I do not know what he did with them. I know that for the next 3 days the ship's humming changed pitch slightly, and there was a faint, sweet smell in the ventilation system that made my stomach turn. The remaining 26 of us underwent the process, and the reason there were only 26 is not that the warband lacked 4 aspirants. 9,000 had been tested on the surface. The warband lacked 4 gene seed. That is the constraint nobody outside the Eye understands about us. The Third Legion's gene seed has been rotting since before the heresy, curdled by 10,000 years in the immaterium, and a warband cannot simply grow itself. Every implant set is bought. Nacrolus maintained a correspondence with the primogenitor. Fabius B. was chief apothecary of this legion once, and this legion cast him out, and every Emperor's Children warband in the Eye will tell you at length what it thinks of the man-flayer and his workshops. Then it sends him its slaves. The price for a viable batch is slaves, tissue samples, and whatever else the clone lord happens to be short of that century. 300 laborers here, a hold full of children there. The Pallid Chord spent 2 centuries feeding its own future into that arrangement, and the count of noise marines in this warband has never once been decided by how many boys could hear. It has been decided by how much bile was asking. The process itself is documented well enough elsewhere. Organ implantation, skeletal reinforcement, muscular enhancement, hypnotic indoctrination, pain, months and months and months of pain, punctuated by brief periods of unconsciousness that were not really sleep, and longer periods of screaming that were not really screaming, because by the fourth month my vocal cords had been replaced with something that produced sounds my old throat could never have managed. Standard Space Marine creation is already a process that kills roughly half of all aspirants. The Emperor's children considered this an unacceptable waste of potential test subjects. What they did to us was standard Space Marine creation with additions. Modifications developed by the apothecary Fabius Bile 10 millennia ago, based on xenobiological research from a species called the Layer, and refined by every deranged fleshcrafter in the Third Legion's history since. My pain receptors were rewired. That was the first modification beyond standard. Every nerve ending in my body was rerouted so that what should have registered as agony instead registered as a complex, layered sensation that my brain had no category for. And it was intense. So intense that for the first 2 weeks after the modification, I could not stop touching things, the texture of ceramite, the temperature of recycled air, the pressure of my own fingers against my own skin. Everything was a revelation. Everything was overwhelming. That feeling lasted approximately 19 days. Then it began to fade. By the 6th month, I could barely feel my own heartbeat. My hearing came later, and it did not come from Nacrolus. What the chirurgeon built was the housing. Additional cochlear structures layered over the lineman's ear. Resonance chambers cut into the mastoid bone. Nerve clusters threaded from the auditory cortex into the parts of the brain that handle emotion and memory and pleasure. 10,000 years of the Third Legion's fleshcraft has gone into perfecting that architecture, and it does nothing on its own. It is scaffolding. It is a room with the door left open. What comes through the door is not a surgical outcome. Every Emperor's child is cut the same way, and not every Emperor's child ends up in the cacophony. And the difference is not skill and not aptitude, and not anything Nacrolus controls. Slaanesh grants the hearing. The Dark Prince looks into the room the chirurgeon prepared, and takes an interest, or does not. Mine arrived in the 7th month, and I could not tell you what it felt like because I was not conscious for it. I went under able to hear what any Astartes hears. I came out of sedation able to detect frequencies from below 1 Hz to above 100 kHz. I could hear the electrical impulses in a power conduit through 3 meters of solid bulkhead. I could hear the crystalline structure of ceramite flexing under thermal stress. I could hear the heartbeat of a man across a room, and from its rhythm alone I could tell you whether he was afraid. And my ears could taste sound. Not only frequency and volume, but texture, weight, color. A bolter firing was rough and red and tasted of iron. The hum of the ship's reactor was smooth and violet, and tasted of something that does not exist in the material world, something between honey and lightning. A human scream was brittle and white and tasted of salt, and the higher the pitch, the sweeter the salt became. Draeven Korr was assigned as my training supervisor. That was irregular. Ordinarily, newly created Emperor's children were trained in groups, indoctrinated through shared experience and mutual competition into the warband's hierarchy. But Draven had specifically requested me. Vekkren, the Lord Cacophonist who commanded our warband, the Pallid Chord, granted the request. Draven taught me to fight. He taught me to maintain my armor, to navigate the strange non-geography of the Eye of Terror, to speak the battle cant of the Third Legion with its layered harmonics and sub-vocal undertones. But mostly he taught me to listen. "There is nothing in creation that does not sound," he told me once, standing in the observation deck of the resonant abyss while the Eye of Terror churned outside the viewports. Matter sounds. Energy sounds. The immaterium itself sounds, though it was never intended that flesh should be shaped to hear it. In the days of the Crusade, we were taught that the Legion's distinction was its pursuit of the perfect stroke, the perfect line, the perfect compliance. That was a smaller ambition than we understood at the time. What distinguishes us from every other warrior the Emperor ever raised is not that we hear the vibration of things. It is that we take the whole disordered noise of creation into our hands and play it as an instrument of war. He gave me my first sonic blaster. It was a crude thing by the standards of our craft, a basic model without the compression rigs and soul vibrators and psycho-siren dials that senior noise marines spend centuries fitting to their weapons. It looked like a bolter that someone had redesigned while having a nightmare. All flared emitters and vibration chambers, and a stock that curved in ways that followed no ergonomic logic I understood. And it was loaded. That is the part the Imperium has never worked out about our weapons in 10,000 years of recovering them off battlefields and handing them to tech priests who take them apart and find nothing. A sonic blaster is not a generator. It is a vessel. The cylinders seated behind the emitter hold sound that was taken from something living, screams harvested at the moment of death, and compressed and kept. And when you fire the weapon, you are not creating a noise. You are letting one out. There are two kinds. Bulk stock comes off the slave decks, harvested in industrial lots, thousands of cylinders filled in a single afternoon from a hold of people who were going to die anyway and were made to do it usefully. That is what you fight with. It is cheap, it is uniform, and no noise marine gives it a second thought, any more than a guardsman thinks about where a last gun pack was charged. The other kind you fill yourself, one at a time, from something you chose. Draven handed me 4 of those with the weapon and did not say whose they were, and I did not ask then. There is a rack in my quarters now, holding the last sounds of people whose faces I could not describe under any pressure you cared to apply. He took me to the firing range, a chamber deep in the resonant abyss that had been lined with the compressed remains of what I was told had been prisoners of war. The walls absorbed sound, or rather, they swallowed it, took it into themselves, and you could hear it echoing inside them for hours afterward if you pressed your ear to the surface. "Fire it," Draven said. I did, and the universe changed. A sonic blaster does not fire a projectile. It does not fire a beam or a pulse or a bolt. What it releases is sound with the warp behind it, and that distinction is the whole of the weapon. Sound alone will rupture an eardrum and shake a wall. Sound with the immaterium pushing through it does something no instrument of the material universe can do. A bolter kills by punching through armor and detonating inside flesh. A las weapon kills by superheating tissue. A sonic blaster reaches the target on 2 levels at once, and the first level takes the body apart, and the second level goes past the body entirely. Ceramite cracks, plasteel shatters, flesh comes undone, not explosively but thoroughly, and whatever the man was carrying behind his eyes gets opened to the warp in the same instant, which is why the ones who take a glancing hit and walk away do not walk far, and why nothing about them afterward is worth calling alive. What it felt like was this. I pulled the trigger and something that had been screaming inside a cylinder for however long Draven had kept it there came out of the barrel all at once. It was the melody my mother hummed at the loom press. It was the structural groan of Hive Dessicara collapsing. It was the chord I had heard in Draeven Korr's armor the night he found me. It was the screaming of the sky above Grethis Mund, and the silence of the drainage conduit, and the hum of the resonant abyss, and my own heartbeat, all of it, all at once, pushed through a barrel and out into the world at a volume that made the air itself flinch. The target at the end of the range came apart. It did not explode, it disaggregated. The compressed matter of the wall behind it cratered. And the sound, it did not stop when I released the trigger. It kept going. It bounced and rebounded and layered on itself, building harmonics that my enhanced ears could track individually, each one a thread in a tapestry of destruction more beautiful than anything I had heard in 14 years of being alive. I stood there with the weapon in my hands and the echoes fading around me. And I understood for the first time why they had taken me from Grethis Mund. Draven was watching me. I turned to look at him, and for a single moment, I saw something on his face that I could not categorize. It was not pride. It was not satisfaction. It was something closer to regret, but that did not make sense to me then, so I filed it away and forgot about it. He said, "Again, Vekkren." There was a hopper of bulk stock against the wall, and he made me work through most of it. I fired again, and again, and again. By the end of that session, the wall of the firing range was gone, not damaged. Gone. The compressed matter that had lined it had been reduced to a fine dust that hung in the air like fog. Through the hole I had made, I could see the inner hull of the ship. It was singing back at me, vibrating sympathetically with the frequencies I had poured into it, and the song it sang was hungry. That was day 1. Day 2, Draven took me to the ship's lower decks and showed me the armorium where the Pallid Chord stored their sonic weaponry. Hundreds of weapons, racked in climate-sealed chambers that maintained specific humidity and temperature conditions because sonic weapons are sensitive instruments, affected by atmospheric density and thermal expansion in ways that conventional arms are not. Each weapon was unique. No two sonic blasters in the armorium were identical because every noise marine modified their weapon over time, adding resonance chambers, swapping emitters, tuning harmonic frequencies to match their personal auditory preferences. They were extensions of the Marines who carried them, shaped by decades or centuries of intimate use into instruments that responded to their owners the way a practiced musician's instrument responds to the hands that play it. Draven let me handle 3 of them. Each one sounded different when I activated its power coupling, the idle hum of a sonic blaster as distinctive as a fingerprint. One hummed in a minor key, dark and heavy. One produced a bright, almost cheerful whine that sounded wrong coming from a weapon of war. The third was nearly silent, its output focused so tightly that only a Marine with my level of auditory enhancement could hear it. A needle-thin frequency that promised precision rather than destruction. "You will build your own," Draven told me. "Every noise Marine does. The weapon you fired yesterday is a training model. It will teach you the fundamentals. But the weapon you carry into war will be yours and no one else's, tuned to the frequencies that only your ears can hear, shaped by the sounds that only your voice can produce. That is what separates us from the other legions. They carry weapons. We become them." 19 of the 37 survived the full transformation, and all 19 of us came out of it as Emperor's children. Not as Noise Marines. Nobody is made a Noise Marine. Slaanesh decides that, and Slaanesh had decided about 11 of us, and not about the other 8, and the warband found out which was which the day they put weapons in our hands. The 8 went to the line companies, infractors and tormentors, chainswords and bolt weapons, the meat and bone around which the cacophony build their symphonies. They are not lesser warriors. 2 of them are still alive, and one of them has killed more men than I have. They simply picked up a sonic blaster and fired it and heard a noise. The 11 of us heard something else. The 8 looked at us differently afterward. Not with fear, exactly, with something closer to pity, as if they understood on some instinctive level that the path we had been put on had no turning off it, and that whatever we were becoming was something they were glad to have been passed over for. What they thought did not reach me. I had found my instrument. I had found my sound. And the galaxy was full of things that had not heard it yet. The first decade was the best. I know that now. I did not know it then because I had nothing to compare it to, no baseline against which to measure the sheer, overwhelming volume of experience that poured through my senses every waking moment. Everything was new. Everything was loud. Everything tasted of colors I did not have names for, and vibrated at frequencies that made my modified bones sing in response. I remember every kill from that first decade with a clarity that later centuries would erode. The first human I killed with a sonic blaster on a world called Vosrek Tertius, a PDF trooper who turned to run and came apart from the ankles up, the sound of his body disaggregating a rising chromatic scale that lasted exactly 2.3 seconds, and under the scale, fainter, the other sound. The one the warp makes when it takes what is behind a man's eyes. I did not have a name for it that first time. I have heard it under every kill since. The first space marine I killed, a son of Guilliman in blue and gold, whose Mark 7 plate cracked along harmonic fault lines that I could see before I even fired, the resonant frequency of Aquila pattern ceramite singing to me like an invitation. The first Eldar, whose scream as she died was a descending minor 7th that I can still hear if I close my eyes. Close my eyes is a phrase I use loosely. My eyelids were taken during the 3rd year of the process and replaced with transparent membranes that let me see even when I sleep. A word about the years, since I have been giving you them as though they meant something. Time in the eye does not run. It pools and doubles back, and in some quarters of the resonant abyss it does not move at all, and there are compartments on the lower decks where a man can walk in and come out 4 days later, having spent an afternoon. What I count is engagements and translations into real space, and the intervals the ship's cogitators mark against imperial reckoning when we are outside. 200 years is what the arithmetic gives me. Whether 200 years happen to me is a separate question, and I have never seen the point of it. The Pallid Chord operated from the resonant abyss as a raiding force, emerging from the Eye of Terror through warp routes that only our navigators could follow. Routes that twisted through the immaterium like screaming corridors of compressed sound. We struck imperial worlds on the fringe of the segmentum obscurus, worlds that were too far from major fleet assets to receive timely reinforcement, too small to warrant permanent Astartes presence, too unimportant for anyone in the vast, grinding bureaucracy of the Imperium to notice they were gone until it was too late. The Imperium is not blind, and it is not forgiving. There are corridors the Pallid Chord has not entered in 300 years, because something in them once took a strike cruiser off us, and the warband never established what. But a subsector is enormous, and a Navy battle group is slow, and a warband that never strikes the same region twice inside a human lifetime is a rumor rather than a campaign. We were a weather event. Weather does not get hunted. The process was always the same. We would enter real space at the edge of a system. Lord Solvek Wren would activate the resonant abyss's warp amplifiers, arrays of Slaanesh-tuned emitters built into the hull of the ship that broadcast a psychosonic signal into the surrounding void at frequencies that bled into the immaterium. Within hours, every astropath in the system would be screaming. Their psychic senses, attuned to the whispers of the warp, could not filter the signal. It drove them mad. It made them broadcast their own madness into the etheric networks they were supposed to use for communication, corrupting every psychic message in and out of the system with noise. Within a day, the target world was deaf and blind, cut off from the Imperium, unable to call for help, unable to warn neighboring systems. Then we descended. The Cacophony have a formation for planetary assault that no loyalist force has ever survived closely enough to document. We call it the Crescendo. The warband deploys in a spiral pattern around the primary target zone, usually the largest population center. The outermost ring is infantry, infractors, and tormentors. Their role simply to establish a perimeter and drive the population inward, compress them. The middle ring is armor and demons, if we have managed to summon any. Their role to absorb counterattack and maintain the integrity of the spiral. And at the center, moving inward with the compression, is the Cacophony. We advance in concert. Each noise marine adjusts the frequency of their sonic weapon to complement the others, building a harmonic structure that grows more complex and more powerful as we move closer together. A single sonic blaster is lethal. 2 sonic blasters fired in harmonical alignment can crack a blast door. 5 can collapse a building. 34, the full complement of the Cacophony. In the years when I joined it, firing in perfect concert could level a city block and leave nothing standing but the foundations. And even the foundations would be singing for weeks afterward, vibrating at frequencies that make the ground itself unstable. A cacophony advance is a structured wall of sonic force that operates on every level at once: physical, psychic, emotional. It cracks walls and ruptures organs and breaks minds. The screams of a person dying to conventional weapons are simple things, pain and fear compressed into a vocal utterance. The screams of a person dying in a cacophony assault have harmonics, overtones, as if the sound we are pushing through them is rearranging something inside their bodies, something deeper than tissue, something that vibrates at a frequency the material world normally cannot hear. And that thing, whatever it is, screams back through their mouths in a voice that is not theirs. Some of us hold that the voice belongs to Slaanesh, that the barrier thins at the moment of sonic death and the prince reaches through. I have no opinion. The sound is exquisite, and hearing it is the nearest thing to satisfaction I have. We raided dozens of worlds in that first decade. Grethis Mund was already fading from my memory by the 3rd year, replaced by a catalogue of sounds that grew longer and more intricate with every campaign. I collected them. Not physically, mentally. Every unique sound I encountered, every new harmonic, every novel frequency, I filed it away in the vast library of my enhanced auditory memory and cross-referenced it against every other sound I had ever heard, looking for patterns, looking for connections, looking for the architecture that underlaid all of it. Draeven encouraged this. He called it training the ear. He would quiz me after engagements, asking me to reconstruct the sonic profile of specific moments in battle. What frequency did the 3rd bolt round detonate at? How many harmonic overtones did the collapsing spire produce? What was the fundamental note of the Imperial commander's scream when his command Chimera was hit by 3 sonic blasters simultaneously? I answered these questions with a precision that seemed to please him, though Draven's definition of pleased was difficult to distinguish from his definition of everything else, because his face had been modified to the point where expression was more a matter of which muscles still functioned than of any deliberate emotional display. But between the training and the raids, Draven also did something that I did not recognize as unusual until much later. He taught me to listen to quiet things, not silence, never silence. A noise marine does not experience silence unless something has gone catastrophically wrong. Our modified hearing ensures that the world is never truly quiet. There is always the hum of electronics, the vibration of matter, the background radiation of the universe itself converted into audio by our enhanced cochlear systems. But within that constant wash of ambient sound, there are gradients. There are degrees of intensity. And Draven made me practice finding the quietest sounds in any environment and focusing on them to the exclusion of the louder ones. He never demonstrated. That is the detail I did not register for 130 years. Every other skill he taught me, he showed me first, the way you show a recruit how to strip a weapon, hands over hands. This one he only described. He would name a compartment and tell me to find the smallest sound in it, and then he would wait. And when I found it, he would ask me what it sounded like. He asked me that every time, and he listened to my answer with an attention he gave to nothing else. And not once in all the years he trained me did he tell me whether I was right. At the time, I thought it was a tactical exercise. Learn to hear the footstep beneath the explosion, detect the whisper beneath the scream. And it was that partially. It made me a better fighter, more attuned to the subtle sounds of an enemy trying to move undetected, more capable of identifying threats in the overwhelming noise of a battlefield. I was promoted to Disharmonist, squad leader of a 5-man cacophony team after the siege of Vornith Septimus. That was a shrine world, a jewel of the Ministorum's ecclesiastical holdings in the subsector, home to 3 major cathedral complexes and a population of 12 million who spent their lives in prayer and devotional labor. Lord Solvek Wren chose it specifically because of what it sounded like. Shrine worlds have a particular acoustic signature. The constant prayer, the hymns, the bells, the chanting, millions of voices raised in worship produce a background hum that you can hear from orbit if your ears are built the way ours are. It is a sound that exists on the boundary between the material and the immaterial, a psychic resonance produced by concentrated faith that vibrates at frequencies normally associated with the warp itself. To the Imperium, this resonance is holy. To the Emperor's children, it is a delicacy. We hit Vornith Septimus like a fist made of sound. The crescendo formation worked flawlessly, 12 million souls compressed inward toward the largest cathedral complex, the Basilica of the Ibon Ter, a structure so massive that its nave could have housed a titan. And into that compressed mass of humanity, the cacophony poured sound. I led my team through the western approach, 5 sonic blasters firing in concert at frequencies I had personally calibrated to resonate with the stone of the basilica. Because that was the point, not just to kill, though we killed. Throne did we kill. Thousands in the first hour, tens of thousands by the third. The point was to make the basilica sing, to take this structure built for the worship of a false god and force it to produce the music of a real one. And it worked. The stone walls of the basilica picked up our frequencies and amplified them, the architecture acting as a natural resonance chamber. It took the sound of our weapons and built on it, layered it, transformed it into something that filled the entire structure. The wave spilled out across the planet's surface and was audible, I was told later, from 3 continents away. That was the day I first heard the song, not the ambient hum of the warp, not the background vibration of Slaanesh corruption that colors everything in the eye of terror. The song, capital S, the sound that the noise marines of the Emperor's children have been chasing since the first cacophony picked up the instruments of the Maraviglia 10,000 years ago and played them until their fingers bled. The sound that Slaanesh makes when the Prince of Pleasure is paying attention. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It had no source I could identify, no direction, no point of origin. It simply was. A single note, impossibly pure, impossibly complex, containing within it every frequency I had ever heard and an infinite number I had not. It had no color. That is the part I have never been able to put to anyone. Every sound I have processed since the gift arrives with a color and a taste fixed to it. Bolter fire as iron, reactor hum as honey and lightning, a scream as salt. The song arrived with nothing attached. My auditory cortex reached for the categories and closed on empty air. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and its absence hit me like a physical blow, a sudden deafness that was worse than any wound I had taken in a decade of war. Every noise marine in the warband heard it. Every one of us stopped what we were doing for those 3 seconds, and when it ended, every one of us wanted it back. Slaanesh shows you a sound you cannot unhear, and then the Dark Prince takes it away. You spend the rest of your existence chasing it. I have heard the song 4 times in 2 centuries. Each time it was briefer. Each time the silence that followed was deeper. Life in the Pallid Chord between campaigns was its own form of warfare. Between raids, the warband turned inward. Every noise marine competed for stimulation. Sonic duels in the resonance chambers of the resonant abyss, where 2 marines would stand at opposite ends of a sealed room and play their weapons at each other, each trying to produce a frequency that would override the other's output. The loser typically suffered burst eardrums, which for a noise marine is less a medical issue and more a profound sensory insult that takes weeks to fully repair. There were other contests, pain rituals borrowed from the homunculi of Komarach, traded for by Lord Wren during one of his rare diplomatic contacts with the Dark City. Sensory deprivation experiments where a marine would be sealed inside a void-shielded chamber with no sound, no light, no tactile input, and left there until the hallucinations began. The hallucinations were the point. A noise marine in sensory deprivation does not simply imagine sounds. The auditory cortex, deprived of external input, begins generating its own, pulling from the vast library of stored frequencies and recombining them in ways that the conscious mind cannot predict. Some Marines reported hearing new sounds, sounds that did not exist in nature, sounds that could only be produced by a mind desperate enough to invent them. These sounds were studied, replicated, built into new weapon configurations. Some Marines did not come out of the chambers at all. Their minds, unable to cope with the absence of sensation, simply switched off. They were not dead. Their bodies continued to function, but the consciousness behind their eyes was gone, retreated into some inner space from which it never returned. The chirurgeon Heth Necrolus would harvest them for parts. I participated in all of it. The duels, the rituals, the deprivation experiments. I was good at the duels. My ear for frequency was better than most, a product of whatever genetic quirk had made me attractive to the warband in the first place, refined by years of Draeven's training in hearing the quiet things beneath the loud. I could find the resonant frequency of another Marine's weapon systems faster than they could find mine, and once I had it, I could tune my sonic blaster to match it, creating a feedback loop that turned their own armor into a weapon against them. The deprivation experiments went worse. In the emptiness, I could hear something I did not want to hear. A melody, 4 notes looping, a song without words that a woman used to hum while she worked a loom press on a world that no longer exists. I stopped participating in the deprivation experiments after my third session. Draven did not ask why. He did not need to. He was the one who retrieved me from the chamber, and he had heard me in there, heard what I was humming to myself in the dark. And his face, his modified, half-frozen, barely expressive face, did something that I chose not to examine too closely. I was a noise marine. I was a disharmonist of the Pallid Chord. I had killed thousands, and I had heard the song of Slaanesh, and I was building a catalog of destruction that would have made the first cacophony weep with envy. I did not need memories. I did not need a melody from a dead world. I needed louder. I needed more. And louder was what I got. By my 60th year with the Pallid Chord, I could no longer feel the vibration of the ship beneath my feet unless the engines were at full burn. Food had no taste. Not that I ate for nutrition. My modified biology handled that through intravenous supplementation. But the act of eating had once provided a minor sensory experience, a texture, a temperature. And now it was nothing. The sensation of killing with a sonic blaster had dulled to a distant echo of its former glory. Even the sonic duels, once the highlight of my existence between campaigns, had become routine. The only things that still registered were the extremes. A cacophony assault on a major population center, the activation of a Doom Siren in enclosed spaces, and the song. Always the song. The memory of those 3 seconds on Vorneth Septimus, the impossibly pure, impossibly complex note that contained everything and promised more. That memory was a wound that did not heal, a hunger that did not diminish, a thirst that no amount of slaughter could quench. I spoke to Draven about it once. We were in the observation deck watching a warp storm consume a dead world that the Pallid Chord had stripped bare 2 decades earlier. The remains of its civilization drifted in the void, fragments of orbital infrastructure and the hulks of ships that had tried to flee and been caught by our guns. It was a quiet moment by our standards. The only sounds were the ship's hum and the faint psychic static of the warp storm. "It gets worse," Draven said. I looked at him. In the decades since I had known him, his appearance had changed. He was old for a noise marine. He had been with the 3rd Legion since long before I was born, though how long was a question he never answered and I never pressed. His face had accumulated modifications the way an ancient building accumulates extensions, each one layered over the last, each one altering the architecture of his skull in ways that moved further from human with every addition. His ears were entirely artificial now, complex arrays of sensor cilia and resonance chambers that extended from his temples like fans. His jaw had been unhinged and rebuilt with a secondary hinge joint that allowed him to open his mouth wider than any human skull should permit. An adaptation for the Doom Siren that turned his entire head into a sound projection system. His eyes were still his own, mostly. They were the only part of him that I could still connect to the face of the Marine who had pulled me from a drainage conduit on Grethis Mund. "It does not get worse," I said. "It gets less." He looked at me, and there was that expression again, the one I had seen on the firing range the day I first used a sonic blaster, the one I had been filing away and ignoring for a century, because it did not fit into any category I was willing to examine. "Yes," he said, "it gets less. That is precisely the correct construction." A pause. "Vekkren, should it ever get less enough that the quiet things become audible to you again, attend to them. Hold to them. Do you understand me?" I did not understand. I said so. He nodded, as if that was the answer he expected. "You will," he said. "Or you will not. It comes to the same." He turned back to the viewport. The warp storm was eating the last fragments of the dead world, pulling them into the immaterium, where they would be dissolved into raw emotion and recycled into the stuff of nightmares. It comes to the same. That was the last time Draven and I spoke about anything that was not war. The campaign that changed everything was not one of our raids. It was a contract. The Emperor's children, for all their obsession with sensation and excess, are not impractical. A warband cannot survive on plunder alone, not when it operates from the Eye of Terror and requires a constant supply of slaves, materiel, ammunition, and the exotic psycho-reactive compounds that our modified nervous systems require to stave off the worst effects of sensory deprivation. Trade is necessary. The terms of trade in the Eye of Terror are simple. You provide what you promised, or you become part of what someone else promised. Alliances, however temporary, are necessary, and so the Pallid Chord, like many warbands of the Third Legion, occasionally entered into arrangements with other forces of the Long War. The contract came from a word-bearer's host called the Quill of Lorgar. They needed a specific kind of weapon, and we were the only ones who could provide it. They were besieging a world called Rethane Primus, a fortress world in the Halcyon Reach that had been holding out against Chaos incursion for 11 years. 11 years of siege, 11 years of orbital bombardment, 11 years of ground assault by word-bearers possessed and their cultist auxiliaries, and the fortress had not fallen. The reason was a series of void shield generators buried deep beneath the planet's surface, generators of a pattern so ancient and so robust that conventional weapons could not penetrate them, and the word-bearers lacked the specialized ordnance to dig them out. Sonic weapons operate on a different principle. A void shield stops matter and energy arriving from real space. It was never built to stop something arriving partly from somewhere else. A cacophony firing in concert pushes a psychosonic wave into the shield's own energy matrix, and the matrix has no protocol for a frequency that is half in the warp, and it comes apart from the inside while the emitters are still reporting nominal. Lord Wren accepted the contract. The price was 300 slaves and access to the word-bearer's warp route charts for the Halcyon Reach, which would open new raiding corridors for the Pallid Chord. It was a good deal. It was also a trap, though not the kind the word-bearers intended, and not one whose jaws would close for another 3 weeks. We deployed alongside the Quill of Lorgar on Rethane Primus's northern continent. The fortress was a sprawling complex of ferrocrete bunkers, trench networks, and weapons emplacements that covered an area roughly the size of a small hive city. It was garrisoned by 3 regiments of Cadian pattern infantry, battle-hardened after 11 years of continuous siege, supported by armored companies and a demi-battery of basilisk artillery that had been firing so long the barrels were being replaced on a weekly rotation. Good soldiers, competent officers, they deserved a better enemy. We walked through it in 4 hours. I led my cacophony team through the western trenchworks while the rest of the warband hit the central bastion. The Cadians were disciplined. I will give them that. They held their positions. They returned fire. Their heavy bolters and lascannons and basilisk shells chewed into the ground around us, and they killed 3 of our infractors in the first 20 minutes. But they were fighting with weapons designed to punch holes in things, and we were fighting with weapons designed to unmake the air itself. You cannot take cover from sound. You cannot dig a trench deep enough. You cannot build a wall thick enough. Sound goes around corners. Sound goes through walls. Sound finds every gap, every crack, every opening, and once it is inside, it fills the space like water filling a drowning man's lungs. The trenchworks were a nightmare for the defenders. Enclosed spaces, tight corners, low ceilings, perfect resonance conditions. My team's sonic blasters turned every bunker into a kill box, the sound bouncing off the walls and amplifying with each reflection until the men inside were being hit from every direction simultaneously. I watched a squad of Cadians die standing up, their bodies intact and their organs turned to slurry inside them, and that was only the half of it I could see. The other half went where I could hear it, and they could not. Whatever Acadian is issued in place of a soul went out of them a half-second before their bodies caught up. They stood there like statues after we stopped firing, already empty, then folded in on themselves like unfilled uniforms. The void shields were deeper down, 300 meters beneath the fortress, accessible by armored elevator shafts that the word-bearers had been trying to breach for over a decade. We did not need the elevators. We found a maintenance tunnel that led to the generator level, a tunnel that the fortress's builders had sealed with 6-inch plasteel blast doors at 20-meter intervals. 30 doors between us and the generators. I found the note that plasteel answers to, and we walked through all 30 in under an hour. Each one burst inward like a soap bubble, the metal neither melting nor breaking, but simply ceasing to agree with itself, shedding into a shower of metallic dust that hung in the air and tasted, to my enhanced senses, of copper and oaths. The void shield generators were old, pre-heresy old, the kind of technology that the Imperium has lost the ability to manufacture and barely retains the ability to maintain. They hummed at a frequency that was almost beautiful, a deep, steady bass note that I could feel in my bones, and for a brief, irrational moment, I did not want to destroy them. They were making a sound I had never heard before, a sound that belonged to an era when the Imperium could still build things that hummed instead of screaming. Then Draven said, "Find it." And I did. It took me 9 minutes to find the note the housing answered to. Frequency is only half of it, and the other half is not written down anywhere and cannot be taught, and every noise marine finds it the same way, which is by listening until the weapon and the target agree on something. I calibrated my team, and we fired in concert, and the generators came apart, and the void shields above us flickered and died, and the word-bearers poured through the breach like a dark tide, and Wraithen Primus fell. I did not see what the word-bearers did to the surviving garrison. I did not need to. I could hear it. 8 kilometers away at the Cacophony staging ground on the northern ridge, I could hear the rituals they conducted, the demonic incantations, the screaming that went on for 3 days and changed in character on the second day from human voices to something that was not human at all. The word-bearers were summoning something, using the death of the fortress and its defenders as fuel for a ritual that tore a hole in reality large enough to pull through something that I could hear breathing, each breath a subsonic rumble that made the planet's tectonic plates shudder. Lord Wren collected our payment. 300 slaves as promised, the warp route charts as promised, and something else, something that was not part of the original contract. The quill of Lorgar's Dark Apostle, a creature whose name I never learned and never wanted to, approached Wren after the battle and offered him a gift. A piece of knowledge, the Dark Apostle called it. A frequency. A specific harmonic pattern that, when broadcast through a Doom Siren at sufficient amplitude, would temporarily thin the barrier between real space and the warp, allowing Slaaneshi entities to manifest more easily in the vicinity. Wren accepted. Of course he did. Any Lord Cacophonist would have. The frequency was encoded into the Doom Sirens of every senior noise marine in the Pallid Chord, including mine. The installation required the chirurgian Heth Necrolas to open every Doom Siren housing individually, remove the existing resonance arrays, calibrate the new crystal against each weapon's unique harmonic profile, and reseal the assembly. It was a process that took 3 days, and it required Necrolas to inspect the internal components of every Doom Siren in the warband at a level of detail that routine maintenance never demanded. That was the trap, not set by the word-bearers. They had no way of knowing what Necrolas would find. But when the chirurgian opened Draeven Korr's Doom Siren on the second day of installations, he found modifications that were not in the surgical logs. Draven had altered his own weapon to mask a discrepancy in the warband's harmonic calibration protocols, a discrepancy that, when Necrolas traced it backward through the records, led to a missing entry in the modification logs for a recently created noise marine. My logs. The tertiary cochlear dampener that should have been installed during my 5th-year surgical series was not listed as implanted. It was not listed as failed. It was not listed at all. It had been erased from the schedule, and the only person with access to the chirurgian's surgical queue, who also had a reason to protect a specific aspirant's hearing, was the aspirant's training supervisor. I did not know any of this at the time. All I knew was that Necrolas performed the modification on my Doom Siren personally, opening the housing, installing the new resonance crystal that vibrated at the specified frequency when my voice hit a particular pitch, and resealing it. It was external work. Housing, crystal, coupling. He had no reason to go into my skull and no reason to check what was already in it. And that is the whole of why the missing dampener sat undisturbed under his hands for over a century. He was not looking. Nobody looks at a component that the rules say is already fitted. I noticed nothing unusual. I noticed nothing at all. A Doom Siren has to be paid for every time it is used. The device runs through the armor and into the flesh, fused to the spine and the throat and the base of the skull, and when you scream through it, the feedback comes back down the same channels and takes the lining of your airway apart. Every noise marine in this legion has felt it. Most of them describe it as the best part. Mine arrives through receptors that were rewired in my first year to file agony as intensity. So what I get is not pain and is not pleasure, and has no name in any language I was raised speaking. It is enormous, and it is immediate, and for as long as it lasts, there is nothing else in my head at all. It worked. On our next raid, a minor agri-world called Fennox Reach, I activated the Doom Siren in the middle of an assault on the primary grain processing facility. The air split open. Daemonettes poured through, 6 of them, translucent and razor-edged, and moving faster than anything that size had any right to move. They carved through the facility's labor force in minutes, and the sounds they made while doing it were finer and more intricate than anything I had heard since the song itself. Each kill produced a note. Each note harmonized with the others. The 6 of them together were a sextet of destruction that played the dying population like an orchestra, and I stood in the middle of it with my Doom Siren screaming, and my enhanced ears drinking in every frequency, and I was, for perhaps 45 seconds, happy. The happiness passed. It always passes. 3 weeks after Necrolas opened his Doom Siren, Draeven Korr was dead. The story I was told, the story that was entered into the Pallid Chord's battle records, was that Draven had fallen during a raid on a Navy supply depot in the Kalanited system. A lucky hit from a defense turret, a macro cannon shell that struck his position and vaporized him before his armor systems could react. A clean death, a warrior's death. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing worth questioning. I did question it. Once. For about 4 seconds, standing in the muster bay while the battle records were read out, I ran the arithmetic. A warning about quiet things. 3 weeks. A macro cannon shell that conveniently left nothing to examine on a raid I had not been assigned to, against a depot that had no macro cannons worth the name. The pieces were the right shape and they fitted together, and I put them down. I did not fail to work it out. I worked it out and stopped. Draven was gone either way, and I had a war to fight and a void to fill. So I filled it. I volunteered for every raid. I pushed my equipment harder, modified my sonic blaster with resonance amplifiers that I traded for, with a dark mechanicum tech adept who traveled with the warband. I experimented with new frequencies, new harmonic combinations, new ways of combining my Doom Siren's output with my blaster's emissions to create layered sonic attacks that could hit a target on multiple frequency bands simultaneously. I got better. I got louder. I got emptier. The warband grew around me. Every raid produced new aspirants, children pulled from the ruins the way I had been pulled from mine, tested and implanted and fed into the cacophony's ranks, or discarded into the infantry. By my 100th year, the Pallid Chord fielded over 200 noise marines, and the warriors who had trained me were a shrinking minority among recruits who had never known anything but the Long War. One of the newer additions was a marine called Tolarn, a blast master specialist with an ear for sustained bass frequencies and the unsettling habit of watching other marines when they thought they were alone. He had been assigned to my cacophony team 3 decades into his service, and I had kept him because his weapon output was precise, even if the rest of him made my skin crawl in ways that my modified nervous system should not have been able to register. There was a campaign during that period that I remember with particular clarity, not because it was remarkable, but because it was the first time I understood that I was broken. We hit a forge world called Hadraxis Quintus on the edge of the Bellicorn Drift, a secondary installation, a production facility for las weapon power packs and infantry-grade optics, defended by 3 maniples of Skitarii Rangers, and a garrison of tech guard whose bodies were more metal than flesh, the sort of target we could strip in under 12 hours. We took 14. The chirurgeon wanted samples. The operation itself was unremarkable. The crescendo formation, the cacophony advance, the systematic dismantling of a world's defenses by the application of focused sound. What was different about Hadraxis Quintus was the forge itself. The interior of the primary manufactorum was a cathedral of machinery, presses and lathes and assembly systems arranged in rows that stretched for kilometers, all of them running, all of them producing sound. Industrial sound, the pounding of stamping machines, the whine of cutting lasers, the rhythmic percussion of automated hammers shaping plasteel into weapon components. And all of these sounds interacted with each other, reflected off the vaulted ceilings, resonated in the ductwork, created an acoustic environment so complex that my enhanced ears could not immediately parse it. It was not music. It was not weapon fire. It was something in between, a machine song, a hymn of production that the Mechanicus had been running continuously for 800 years. I stopped in the doorway of that manufactorum and listened, and for perhaps 10 seconds the sound filled every receptor I had, all frequencies, all harmonics, all at once. Total saturation. No room in it for the gray flatness that had been eating my sensory world from the edges inward. 10 seconds. Then my auditory cortex adapted. The processing load dropped. The sound became manageable, then mundane, then boring. In 10 seconds, a sonic environment that would have overwhelmed any unmodified human for a lifetime went from extraordinary to ordinary in my enhanced perception. The garrison of Hadraxis Quintus fought well. Cybernetic soldiers with galvanic rifles and arc weapons, and the cold, mechanical discipline of beings whose fear responses had been surgically excised. They held their defensive positions in the lower forge levels for 6 hours, longer than most human forces managed. I killed 47 of them personally. The 47th was a Skitar Alpha, the senior surviving officer, who had taken a sonic blaster hit to the torso that had disaggregated everything below his ribcage and was still firing his radium carbine from behind a blast barrier with one remaining arm, his augmetic legs trailing behind him as broken wreckage. I finished him with a Doom Siren burst at close range, and the sound his cybernetic body made as it came apart was interesting, because the second layer arrived faint and slow. The Mechanicus takes a man and doses his mind down to a whisper, cortex governors and pain suppressors and the right of pure thought. And by the time it is done, there is barely a person left awake in there to notice its own soul leaving. His went quietly. Most of them go quietly. It is the ones still fully occupying themselves who make the loudest sound on the way out. Metal and flesh disaggregating at different rates, producing a discordant two-tone that layered in a way I had not heard before. It was interesting for approximately 4 seconds. Then it was not. 47 kills, and the only one that registered was a 4-second harmonic anomaly produced by a dying machine man's body. There were other campaigns, dozens of them. A naval station in the Volturna Passage, where we destroyed 3 frigates by broadcasting a resonance frequency through the void that caused their hull plating to vibrate apart. A death world called Omegar, where the local fauna produced biosonic attacks that were briefly fascinating. Creatures the size of ground cars that screamed at frequencies capable of liquefying bone. Their calls a complex, predatory language that my enhanced ears could partially decode. We harvested their vocal organs and built them into experimental weapon modifications that worked for a while, and then stopped working when the biological components decayed, because Xenos tissue does not survive long in the warp-saturated environment of an Emperor's Children vessel. A shrine world dedicated to some local saint whose name I did not bother to learn, where the population fought back with improvised sonic defenses of their own. Some local ecclesiarchy invention involving organ pipes mounted on the cathedral walls that broadcast amplified hymns at volumes designed to disorient attackers. They were not effective against noise marines. Our hearing is modified to filter psychic interference, and the hymns, while impressive in volume, lacked the harmonic complexity to damage our equipment. We silenced the organs in the second hour and used the pipes as resonance chambers for our own weapons, turning the cathedral's defenses against the population it was supposed to protect. The sound of imperial hymns converted into Slaaneshi weapon fire was, I admit, satisfying. For approximately 9 seconds. I heard the song twice more in that stretch. The second time was on a void station in the Gavar corridor, 2.5 seconds, while a pressure hull came apart around 2,000 people. The third was on a world whose name I did not record, barely 2 seconds, in the middle of an action so unremarkable that I have no other memory of the day attached to it. Both times I stopped firing. Both times the Marines around me stopped firing. Neither occasion gave me anything to carry away except the arithmetic. 3 seconds on Vorneth Septimus. 2.5. 2. Whatever is on the far side of that sound is becoming less interested in me, not more, and it is letting me know by degrees. Between campaigns, the warband's internal competitions intensified. Sonic duels became more frequent and more violent. 3 Marines died in duels during the period between Hadraxis Quintus and the next major campaign, their auditory systems overloaded by opponents who had modified their weapons beyond safe parameters. The deaths were not mourned. They were catalogued. The specific frequencies that had killed them were recorded and studied, because a frequency capable of overloading a Noise Marine's enhanced auditory system was, by definition, an extremely potent weapon, and if it could be replicated safely, it had value. Solvik Wren began hosting what he called recitals. He instituted them 4 years after Draeven Korr went onto the table. It took me another century to notice that. Draven heard me fire a sonic blaster several thousand times. He stood beside me in trench works and manufactorum floors and the generator vaults under Rethane Primus, and he heard every shot I took for 69 years. None of it was what he wanted. Combat is not performance. On a battlefield, you fire at the frequency that kills what is in front of you, and the small register has no use there. And a Noise Marine playing in the lesser range in the middle of an assault is a Noise Marine getting his squad killed. What Draven needed was a chamber with tuned walls, and a Marine with time to choose his frequencies, and an audience obliged to sit still and listen to the whole of it. That room did not exist while he was alive. Wren built it 4 years after Nacrolus finished with him. These were gatherings of the full cacophony complement in the Resonant Abyss's main resonance chamber, a space designed for the purpose, its walls tuned to specific harmonic frequencies that could be adjusted to create different acoustic environments. Each Marine would take a turn performing, not speaking, not singing in any conventional sense, but using their Doom Sirens and sonic blasters to produce a sequence of sounds that was evaluated by the group on criteria that included harmonic complexity, emotional impact, and destructive potential. It was competition and art and worship all at once, and it was the closest thing the Pallid Chord had to culture. I performed well at the recitals. My ear for quiet frequencies, the legacy of Draven's training, and my missing dampener gave me an advantage in harmonic complexity. I could hear overtones that other Marines could not detect and build them into my performances, layering subtle frequencies beneath the primary output of my weapons in ways that produced an overall sound that was denser, richer, more textured than what my peers could achieve. Wren noticed. He promoted me to Senior Disharmonist, responsible for coordinating the harmonic calibration of the full cacophony complement during major operations. I want that understood in proportion. I had been alive for something over a century. The warriors I was given authority over included legionaries who had carried sonic weapons at Eastfon and had been narrowing their own hearing since before the Imperium had a word for what we became. Among the cacophony, 100 years is not seniority, it is infancy. Men with 10,000 years of practice took harmonic calibration from a boy, barely off the surgical table, and the reason they did is that the boy could hear a register they had all had cut out of them, and not one of them knew that was why, and neither did I. That was where I sat for the better part of a century, Senior Disharmonist, rising in a hierarchy I did not understand the shape of, killing worlds and collecting their sounds and feeling less each year than the year before. And then, 131 years after Draven's death, I went looking for answers. It started with a discrepancy. In the decades since the Word-Bearer's frequency crystal had been installed in my Doom Siren, I had noticed something that I could not explain. My weapon's output had changed, not in power, not in frequency range, but in texture. There was a quality to the sound my Doom Siren produced that the other Marines' weapons did not share. A warmth, if that word can be applied to a weapon that liquefies flesh. a responsiveness that went beyond mechanical function, as if the weapon was not just amplifying my voice, but interpreting it, shaping the output in ways that reflected not just what I was screaming, but how. The other noise marines fired their Doom Sirens and produced raw sonic force. I fired mine and produced something that had, for lack of a better word, expression. I had dismissed it for decades as a product of my superior hearing, my ability to detect and control subtleties that other Marines could not. Then, at a recital in that same year, Vekkren came down from the gallery while the chamber was still ringing and laid one hand flat against the housing on my back. "Something in here is breathing," he said. "I have listened to 4,000 of these, Vekkren. Yours is the only one that answers when it is spoken to." His fingers moved across the casing without hurry, the way a man runs a hand along the flank of an animal he is considering buying. "Have Nacrolus open it. I want to know what he put inside." Then he lost interest, the way he lost interest in anything that did not resolve within a minute, and he walked back up to the gallery. The order stood, though. Ren never rescinds anything. He simply stops carrying it, and it goes into the chirurgion's queue, like everything else, and in 11 days or 100, Nacrolus would have worked down to it and opened my Doom Siren and found what was inside it before I did. But I heard what was underneath the order. Ren had listened to 4,000 Doom Sirens across 10,000 years, and mine was the only one that had ever sounded like it was answering. That was not a compliment. That was a question, and it was aimed at me, and I did not have a reply. I carried it for 11 days. Then I went to the workshop and took the requisition slate off the queue rail with my own hand and put it at the bottom of the rack where the chirurgion files completed work, and nobody ever asked about it. That is the first thing I ever stole from Vekkren. It bought me the 11 days I needed to be the one who heard the recording. Not for an upgrade, but for the surgical records of my Doom Siren's construction and every modification performed on it since. Heth Nacrolus kept recordings of his work the way an artist keeps a portfolio, audio logs of every major procedure, cataloged by subject and by component serial number. They were available to any member of the warband who wished to listen. Most Marines visited the workshop for the recordings of combat surgeries, the sounds of flesh being reshaped, a form of entertainment that the Emperor's children find stimulating. Nobody visited for equipment maintenance logs. There was nothing interesting about the sound of a resonance crystal being calibrated. I found the data crystal filed under my Doom Siren's serial designation. Nothing about it was hidden, which is the part I fixated on afterward. It was sitting in the rack between the crystals for the weapons of 2 other Disharmonists, labeled in Nacrolus's precise hand. The chirurgian is an archivist before he is anything else. It would not occur to him to destroy a record of his own finest work, simply because that work had been an execution, any more than a sculptor would burn a commission because he disliked the man who paid for it. And nobody had ever listened to it, because nobody had ever had a reason to care what a Doom Siren sounded like on the inside. I played it. It was a surgical record. Audio only, no visual feed, just the sounds of a procedure conducted in this very workshop. I heard the hum of medical instruments, the wet sounds of tissue being separated, the click and whine of bone saws and nerve graft tools. And beneath all of that, a voice I recognized. Draeven. He was not screaming. That was the first thing I noticed. In surgical recordings, the subjects almost always scream because the Emperor's children do not use anesthesia. Pain is sensation, and sensation is not to be wasted. But Draven was not screaming. He was talking. The second thing took longer. He was not talking to Necrolus. Everything he said, the chirurgeon already knew, having traced the discrepancy, filed the report, and been handed the instruments. Draven was speaking past him into the archive to whoever would one day have reason to pull the internal history of a specific weapon. "The boy hears it," Draven said. "He still hears quiet things. I kept the tertiary cochlear dampener out of his modification set. Told Necrolus it was a calibration error. He can still hear below the combat threshold. He can still hear music." A pause. The sound of something wet being moved, metal on bone. "Do not mistake this for a kindness. I was born on Chemos in the years before the Emperor found us, and there was rain there that fell on the manufactorum roofs, and I would stand beneath it because the sound of it was worth the standing. I was not yet anything the Legion had laid hands upon. My own dampener was fitted with the first of the cacophony sets, after Istvan, while Virosean's artificers were still determining which portions of a legionary must be closed before the weapons will consent to sing. I have sought that register in every system this Legion has put to the torch since, and it is not in any of them, and it does not return. What the Prince takes, the Prince keeps. So I set about making something worth hearing. Every instrument in this Legion is bounded by the same range, because the same door was shut in all of us at the same hour, and in 10,000 years I have heard every arrangement that range will yield. It is exhausted. There is nothing further in it. But a legionary who retains the lesser register would play otherwise. He would lay things beneath the sound that the rest of us can no longer reach after them. I wish to stand in a chamber and hear that done. There was no more to it than that. I have built an instrument, and I have waited 3 centuries to hear it played properly, and I shall not." Something was clamped. Something else came free with a sound like a boot lifting out of mud. "I have attempted this 4 times. 4 aspirants across 3 centuries, which is the span since anything within the range last surprised me. The first 2 lacked the constitution for it. Without the dampener, their combat processing came apart at the seams, and both were lost in their earliest engagements, drowning in what they could not filter. The third endured 40 years, until Ren marked the anomaly in his harmonic output during a recital and ordered the fitting done. He was stripped of it inside a day. The lesser register, the whole faculty beneath the threshold, gone. He became what the rest of us are. Another instrument bounded like all the others. You are not that, Vekkren. Your processing bears the additional burden without cost to your function in the line. You hold both registers at once. In 300 years I have found no other who can." Another pause. Longer. The sound of Draven's breathing, ragged now, each exhale producing a faint harmonic undertone from his modified vocal cords. They came upon it through the word-bearer's fitting. Necrolus was obliged to open every Doom Siren in the warband, every housing, and in mine he found the alterations I had made to conceal the discrepancy in your harmonic profile. He traced it back. He consulted the surgical rolls. The dampener was to have been fitted in your first year, with the rest of the induction series, before you were ever put in a line. It does not give, and it does not take. It narrows. The Prince grants the hearing entire, both registers together, and then we go in afterward with a blade and shut off the half of it that has no use on a battlefield. Every cacophonist in the eye has had it done. It is not a mutilation, whatever it sounds like. It is the difference between a warrior who can fight and a warrior drowning in every whisper within 9 kilometers. But the half we close is the half where music lives, and once it is closed, the Prince does not open it again. He does not repeat a gift. Without the fitting, a legionary hears in both directions. With it, he hears only the loud. A third pause, the shortest. Something mechanical activating, a whine building in pitch. Wren has ordered the fitting carried out in you, the full tertiary series, next cycle. And Wren ordered this, what is being done to me presently, on the reasoning that a Disharmonist who compromises the combat modifications of his own squad is no Disharmonist at all. He is a saboteur. The Pallid Chord keeps a particular punishment for sabotage. A fourth pause, the longest. When he spoke again, his voice had lost most of its upper range, and what was left of it was flat and wet and very quiet. If this reaches you, then the fitting was never carried out. I do not know by what oversight. Attend to the small things. They are the only portion of you that remains your own. The sounds that followed were not speech. They were the sounds of a procedure that lasted, according to the timestamp embedded in the crystal's data header, 4 hours and 17 minutes. I listened to all of it. I could not stop listening. My enhanced ears picked up every frequency, every overtone, every harmonic of what was being done to Draeven Korr in that room. They took him apart. Not killed him. Took him apart. Heth Necrolus, with the methodical precision that made him the finest chirurgeon in the Pallid Chord, disassembled Draeven Korr's body into its component systems and rebuilt those systems into something else. I heard the removal of Draeven's vocal cords, the careful extraction of his larynx, his trachea, the nerve clusters that connected them to his brain. I heard the resonance testing, Necrolus striking each piece of harvested tissue with a tuning probe and measuring its acoustic response, selecting the components that vibrated most faithfully, discarding the ones that did not meet his standards. I heard Draeven's last sounds, not words, not screams, just the involuntary noises of a body that was losing the ability to make sound, one organ at a time. And then I heard the installation, the sounds of Draeven's harvested tissue being mounted into a resonance housing, the calibration tones as Necrolus tested the assembly, the final satisfied hum of the chirurgion as the new component produced a test tone of exceptional clarity, a component designed to be installed in a Doom Siren. My Doom Siren. I stood in the chirurgian's workshop with the data crystals still playing through the speakers, and I understood. Draeven Korr had not died on a raid in the Kalunited system. He had died in this room, on this table, and his death had been used to build the instrument that I wore on my back. Every scream I had channeled through the Doom Siren for the last 131 years had passed through his harvested tissue. His vocal cords, his nerve clusters, his resonance structures, all of them rebuilt and incorporated into the weapon that sat between my shoulder blades, amplifying my voice, shaping my output, adding the harmonic complexity that had always made my Doom Siren feel different from the others. And I understood something else. Wren had ordered the dampener installed in me during the next surgical cycle, but the next surgical cycle had been consumed by this, by the construction of my Doom Siren from Draeven's remains. Necrolus had used the scheduled slot for the more complex procedure. The dampener installation was deferred to the cycle after that. Then there had been a campaign, and then another. And then the Pallid Chord had moved on to new obsessions the way the Emperor's children always do. The administrative order had rotted in the chirurgian's queue like a forgotten requisition form in an administratum dead file. 131 years. Nobody had followed up. Nobody had checked. I had been screaming through my dead mentor's throat for 131 years. Every time I had felt that peculiar intimacy with the weapon, that sense that it understood what I was trying to produce, it was because some fragment of Draeven's nervous system still functioned within the housing. still reacting to my voice, still shaping the sound with whatever remnant of consciousness survived in those repurposed nerve endings. The recording ended. The workshop was quiet. My enhanced ears could hear the ship around me, the ever-present hum, the pulse of the reactor, the distant vibrations of the warband going about its business. And beneath all of it, for the first time in over a century, I could hear my own Doom Siren. Not its dormant hum, the low-level vibration it produced even when inactive. Something else. Something beneath that. A frequency so faint that without my enhanced hearing, I would never have detected it. A heartbeat, not mine, not the ship's. A heartbeat coming from inside the weapon on my back, produced by a cluster of cardiac tissue that Necrolus had included in the assembly. Perhaps as a biological power source, perhaps as a joke, perhaps because some part of Draven's body had simply refused to stop. It came through gray, and it tasted of wet stone. Nothing else in 200 years has tasted of that. Draeven Korr was dead, but his heart was still beating inside my Doom Siren, and it had been beating there the whole time, and I had never heard it because I had never listened for quiet things. I left the workshop. I did not report what I had found. I did not confront Lord Wren. I did not seek out the chirurgeon. I thought about the sentence in the middle of it, the one he had put there before he explained anything else. Do not mistake what this was. He had known exactly who would eventually hear the recording, and he had made certain that the first thing I understood about him was that he had not been kind. He had wanted a sound. He had spent 3 centuries and 4 aspirants, and finally his own body trying to build something that could produce it, and the thing he built was me. And he went on to Necrolus's table without ever standing in a room and hearing it play. A Slaanesh Astartes who spends 3 centuries working toward a sensation is the most ordinary object in this galaxy. The instrument outlived the audience. It plays for nobody now, and it keeps hearing things nobody wants. I went to my quarters and I sat in the dark, which is a phrase I have no right to, since the membranes that replaced my eyelids do not close, and there has been no true dark behind my eyes in 2 centuries. I sat in the dim, and I listened to the heartbeat on my back, and I felt something that I had not felt in so long that I had to search through my enhanced memory banks to identify it. It arrived through the rewired receptors as pressure rather than pain, the way everything has arrived since my first year, and my nervous system logged an intensity and offered me no name to go with it. I supplied the name myself, out of a language I stopped using at 14. It was grief. Nothing had registered at that volume in decades. The grief did not fade. It should have. Every sensation I experienced faded. That was the fundamental truth of my existence. The diminishing returns that Slaanesh's modifications imposed on every experience. But the grief held. It sat in my chest like a resonance in a sealed chamber, bouncing off the walls of my ribcage, refusing to decay. And as it held, it did something that grief should not have been able to do in a nervous system as modified as mine. It made other things audible. I began hearing quiet things again. The texture of recycled air moving through ventilation ducts, the faint crystalline whine of lumens warming up. The particular way that ceramite boots sounded on different deck plating, each section of the ship producing a subtly different pitch. Sounds I had stopped noticing decades ago, sounds that had been buried beneath the constant roar of my augmented hearing's higher registers. They surfaced. Not loudly, not with the overwhelming intensity that would have made them register on my dulled nervous system. Softly, like whispers beneath a scream, like the quiet things Draven had trained me to hear, the missing component. Without it, I heard both ways. The weapon fire and the screaming and the Doom Siren's roar, and underneath all of it, the heartbeat, the ventilation, the whisper of metal cooling in the void. Draven had died over that missing component. Not to give it to me, to keep it in me where it was useful to him, but the effect was the same either way, and the effect was that I could hear things which were not weapons, in some buried and nearly inaccessible corner of a brain built for nothing else. The second thing that happened was that Lord Solvek Wren announced our next campaign, and when I heard the target, the grief in my chest turned into something colder, something that had edges. The target was Grethis Mund. I had not thought about Grethis Mund in over a century. The world where I was born, the hive where I grew up, the drainage conduit where I sat in the dark and sang a song I did not know the words to. It had been filed away in my enhanced memory banks under a category I never accessed, a section of my past that served no tactical purpose and provided no sensory value. I knew it was there. I could retrieve any detail if I chose to. The temperature of the air in sub-level 38, the resonant frequency of the drainage conduit, the 4 notes of my mother's melody, all of it stored with the inhuman precision of an auditory system that never forgot a sound. But I never accessed it, the way you never open a door that you know leads to a room you have sealed for good reason. Lord Wren's briefing was delivered in the Resonant Abyss's command chapel, a vaulted chamber whose walls were inlaid with resonance crystals that amplified his voice to every corner of the warband. Wren was a performer as much as a commander, and his briefings were compositions in their own right, his voice modulated to produce subharmonics that carried emotional weight beneath the informational content. When he spoke of targets, you felt hunger. When he spoke of the enemy, you felt contempt. When he spoke of Slaanesh, you felt the edge of something vast and beautiful pressing against the inside of your skull. Grethis Mund, he explained, had recovered. The world that the Pallid Chord had stripped 2 centuries ago had been resettled. The Imperium, in its plodding, relentless way, had poured resources back into the damaged hive cities, shipped in new populations from overcrowded worlds in neighboring subsectors, and rebuilt Grethis Mund into a functioning production center. Hive Dessicara, my hive, had been reconstructed from the foundations up, taller and more densely populated than before. 22 million souls now lived where 12 million had lived when I was taken, which is a thin population for a structure that size. Dessicara was never finished. It was gutted before it had finished growing the first time, and the reconstruction sealed off whole strata rather than rebuild them, and the resettlement drafts out of the neighboring subsectors never came close to filling what the original plans allowed for. Most of the hive was empty. The Imperium simply stacked the living into the levels that still held pressure and welded the rest shut. The Imperium rebuilds the way a scab forms. Stubborn, mindless, exactly on top of the wound. Wren's interest in Grethis Mund was not nostalgic. He read the world's designation off the slate in front of him, gave the acoustic survey to his engineers, and assigned the Western approach to Vekkren Thoss without any indication that the 2 facts had anything to do with each other. He did not know. There was no reason he should have. My origin is 1 line in a surgical roll that nobody has opened since the year it was written. His interest was practical, and its origin was our own history. 2 centuries ago, when the Pallid Chord first raided Grethis Mund, the cacophonized sonic assault had done something to the hive's infrastructure that no conventional bombardment could replicate. Concentrated sonic weapon fire at the intensities we deploy does not just destroy material, it alters it. The frequencies we pump through ferrocrete and plasteel and rockcrete change the crystalline structure of those materials at the molecular level, locking residual vibrations into the lattice in ways that persist long after the weapons fall silent. And the Imperium rebuilt on those foundations, because the Imperium always rebuilds on the foundations. Clearing a hive down to bedrock takes decades and a labor force that nobody in the administratum is willing to requisition for a textile world in the Cruentus subsector. What they do instead is survey what is standing, condemn what is not, and raise the new levels off the old grid, because the old grid is already surveyed and the templates for everything above it are Mechanicus standard and have not changed in 4,000 years. The sublevels came back with the same conduit diameters, the same tunnel cross-sections, the same drainage runs, because those specifications are not decisions anybody makes. They are a pattern that is stamped out wherever a hive is put up. So the engineers built on material that was still singing, still vibrating at frequencies imprinted into its structure by our weapons 200 years earlier. The rebuilt hive had incorporated those altered foundations into its new architecture, and on top of those foundations, the Ministorum had built a massive cathedral factorum complex called the Canticle Works that produced devotional audio recordings for distribution across the subsector. Hymns, prayers, sermons, the spoken testimonies of saints and martyrs. All of it recorded and duplicated on data crystals and shipped to thousands of worlds. The Canticle Works produced sound, industrial quantities of sound, and because it was built on foundations that carried the residual acoustic signature of our weapons, that sound had been contaminated, a harmonic pattern embedded in every devotional recording, so subtle that only ears modified to the degree that ours were could detect it. Not imperial, not human, not Xenos, ours. The echo of the Pallid Chord's weapons, 2 centuries old, bleeding through the foundations into every hymn and prayer the Canticle Works produced. Wren's intelligence operatives had detected the pattern but could not identify it. They did not recognize it as the acoustic fingerprint of our own warband's sonic assault, because nobody had thought to cross-reference it against our own weapon signatures from a campaign that predated most of the warband's current members. Wren heard the analysis and saw only a mystery, a new sound, an unknown frequency, a harmonic pattern that defied identification. For a Lord Cacophonist, that was not just a curiosity, it was a treasure, and he was willing to descend on a 22 million soul hive world to claim it. I should have declared it. A warrior with a personal connection to a target is a vulnerability, and the warband's operational protocols are explicit about it. I said nothing, because I wanted to go. Not for sentimental reasons. Not because I wanted to see my home again or revisit the places of my childhood. I wanted to go because Grethis Mund was the place where I had first heard music, and somewhere in the wreckage of my modified brain, in the space that Draven's missing dampener had left open, there was a signal telling me that going back might let me hear it again. We translated into real space at the edge of the Grethis system 31 days later. The astrographic data was correct. Grethis Mund orbited a yellow dwarf star that I recognized, though I had only seen it from the surface and never from space. The planet itself looked different from orbit than I had imagined. Smaller, browner. The hive cities were visible as gray-white growths on the surface, clustered along the equatorial belt where the climate was least hostile. Hive Dessicara was the largest, a vertical sprawl of metal and ferrocrete that climbed 12 kilometers into the atmosphere and burrowed an unknown depth into the planetary crust. Lord Wren deployed the standard protocol: warp amplifiers, astropathic disruption, orbital suppression of defense assets, which in Grethis Mund's case amounted to 3 weapons platforms that were slightly newer and slightly more functional than the ones that had failed to protect the world the first time. The PDF had been reinforced since the Reconstruction, 4 regiments instead of 3. But they were garrison troops on a world that had not seen conflict in living memory, and they reacted to our arrival the way garrison troops always do, too slowly. The crescendo formation deployed around Hive Dessicara at dawn, local time. I led my cacophony team, expanded now to 7 Marines following the addition of 2 recruits from our most recent aspirant intake through the Western Industrial District. The same approach vector, roughly, that I had used on Vorneth Septimus. The same spiral compression, the same methodical advance, driving the population inward, compressing them toward the center. It felt like routine. For the first 3 hours, it was routine. The PDF broke within 40 minutes of contact. The civilian population panicked and fled inward, as populations always do, seeking the illusory safety of the Hive's deeper levels. My team's sonic blasters carved through the industrial district's prefabricated hab blocks with mechanical efficiency, each building collapsing in a shower of disaggregated material that filled the air with particulate dust and the complex, layered sound of structural failure. I was listening to the buildings fall, cataloging the frequencies, cross-referencing them against my stored library, and that was when I heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was coming from below, from the lower levels of the Hive, the sub-levels, the old infrastructure beneath the rebuilt city. A sound that my enhanced ears identified instantly. A sound so specific and so familiar that my auditory cortex flagged it before my conscious mind had time to process what it was. A child singing. Thin and pale and tasting of almost nothing, because an untrained voice carries barely any harmonic content, and my modifications were never built to find anything in a sound that plain. Not well. Not with any particular grace. A child's voice, thin and frightened, pushing a melody through clenched teeth in the dark. A melody of 4 notes looping over and over. A melody without words. My mother's song. I stopped. In the middle of a cacophony advance, in the middle of a crescendo assault on a hive city of 22 million, I stopped moving. My team continued for 6 paces before the nearest Marine, Tolarn, noticed that my sonic blaster had gone silent and turned to look at me. I did not see his expression. I was not looking at him. I was looking at the ground beneath my feet, at the cracked ferrocrete of the industrial district's foundation layer, and I was listening to the voice that was coming from somewhere below it. Sublevel 38. The drainage conduits. The same infrastructure, rebuilt but acoustically identical, the same pipe diameters, the same tunnel cross-sections, the same resonance characteristics that I had mapped with my ears 2 centuries ago in the dark. A child was down there, hiding from the bombardment, hiding from the screaming, hiding from the wall of sonic death that was advancing through the upper levels of the Hive. And the child was singing the same song I had been singing when Draeven Korr found me. The song was common, a worker's tune hummed in the factorums of Hive Dessicara for generations, passed from mother to child in the loom press halls and the assembly lines, a melody that helped the hands keep rhythm through a long shift. Thousands on Grethis Mund knew it. Hundreds of children were probably singing it to themselves in the dark that morning. But I heard it. With the ears Draeven Korr had left unfinished, with the cochlear sensitivity the missing dampener preserved, I heard this one child's version of this one melody through 300 meters of fair. Crete and rock, Crete and metal. I heard the slight variations in pitch where the child's voice wavered with fear. I heard the intake of breath between each loop of the four-note phrase. I heard the echo pattern of the drainage conduit, and from it I could calculate the exact dimensions of the space the child was hiding in, and it was the same conduit. The same one. They had rebuilt it to the same specifications, because Imperial engineering does not innovate, it replicates. And the drainage conduits of sub-level 38 were built to a Mechanicus standard template that had not changed in 4,000 years. Toulon was saying something. I could hear him, but I was not processing his words. My attention was on the melody. My enhanced auditory cortex was pulling it apart, analyzing each note, comparing it to the version stored in my memory. The version I had been singing when Draven found me. The differences were minimal. A slightly different tonal center. A breath in a different place. But the melody was the same. 4 notes, looping, a mother's song. I could hear all of it. The cacophony assault in the northern sector, the harmonic cascade of 7 sonic blasters firing in concert. The screaming of the civilian population compressed into the central districts. 22 million voices producing a wall of sound so dense that my enhanced ears could distinguish individual screams within it, each one a unique frequency signature, each one a life in the process of ending or about to end. The Doom Siren activations from the southern approach, the deep chest-rattling roar of weaponized voices channeled through amplification systems that turned air into a killing medium. And beneath all of it, so quiet that no one else in the warband could possibly hear it, the child singing in the drainage conduit. I knew what was going to happen. The crescendo would compress the population into the core of the hive. The cacophony would advance inward, and the sonic assault would penetrate to the lower levels. The sublevels would shake themselves apart under the accumulated resonance of 200 noise marines firing in concert. The drainage conduits would collapse. The child would die. Not because anyone targeted the child specifically. Not because the child mattered to the operation. The child would die because the child was in the space that would be destroyed, the same way millions of other people were in spaces that would be destroyed, the same way the previous population of Grethis Mund had been destroyed 2 centuries ago, when the Pallid Chord came for the first time. I was the weapon that had destroyed this world before. I was the weapon that would destroy it again. And somewhere in the foundations of the hive I had been born in, a child was singing the song I had been singing when the weapon found me. And I did not stop. I heard the child singing, and I recognized the melody, and I understood the symmetry of what was happening, and I raised my sonic blaster, and I resumed the advance. But the 6 seconds I had stood motionless were 6 seconds too many. Tularn had been watching me. He fell back into formation without a word, his sonic blaster resuming its output in perfect harmonic alignment with the rest of the team. But I could hear the change in his breathing pattern, the slight elevation in his heart rate, the particular quality of silence that a noise marine produces when he is choosing not to speak about something that he intends to speak about later. I had heard that quality of silence before, in the hours before Draven was summoned to the command chapel. It is the sound of a report being composed in someone's head. The operation continued for 11 hours. By the end of it, Hive Dessicara was a ruin, again. The Canticle Works, the target of the entire operation, was secured by the infractors in the 7th hour. Lord Wren's sonic engineers spent 4 hours analyzing the facility's recording equipment and the foundations beneath it, and identified the source of the anomalous harmonic pattern. It was us, the residual acoustic signature of our own sonic weapons from 200 years ago, locked into the crystalline structure of the original foundations, bleeding upward through the rebuilt architecture and contaminating every recording the facility produced. The unknown frequency that had drawn Ren across a subsector was the echo of the Pallid Chord's own assault, still vibrating in the bones of a hive city that we had destroyed and that the Imperium had been foolish enough to rebuild on top of the wreckage. Ren was furious. Not at the outcome, not at the irony, but at himself. 22 million souls for a frequency we had left in the foundations ourselves the first time we came. Even by our standards, the exchange rate was poor. I watched him destroy the canticle works with his voice. Ren's Doom Siren was the most powerful in the warband, a baroque instrument of layered resonance chambers and amplification arrays that had been built and rebuilt over centuries, incorporating components harvested from dozens of sources, some biological, some mechanical, some that defied either classification. He stood in the center of the recording facility and he screamed, and the scream was not a weapon in any tactical sense. It was an expression of something that would have been rage in a being capable of simple emotions, but which in Ren was a complex, multi-layered sensation of frustration and disgust, and the specific form of betrayal that comes from anticipating a new experience and receiving banality instead. The scream lasted 43 seconds, and it reduced the canticle works to rubble, the recording crystals and production equipment, and the walls and ceiling and floor all coming apart in a cascade of resonant destruction that expanded outward from Ren's position in a perfect sphere. 11 workers who had survived the initial assault and been cowering in a storage chamber adjacent to the main facility were killed by the peripheral shockwave. They did not die quickly. The edge of a Doom Siren's output does not kill cleanly the way the center does. It vibrates tissue at sub-lethal frequencies, shaking organs loose from their connective tissue, rupturing blood vessels in patterns that produce maximum pain before eventual systemic failure. I could hear them dying for several minutes afterward, their screams a ragged, discordant chorus that Ren did not appear to notice or care about. He took his frustration out on the surviving population as well, ordering a full harvest. What the harvest recovered was 11,000 names on a manifest out of 22 million in the span of a single planetary rotation. 11,000 is 1 in 2,000. Slaves are not loot in this warband. Slaves are what we pay the primogenitor with. And Ren turned 2 centuries of implant sets into rubble because he had been embarrassed in front of his own cacophony. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever does. I did not participate. Not because I chose not to, because my role was complete. The cacophony had done their work. What remained was the harvesting, the sorting of survivors into categories, slaves, sacrifices, aspirant candidates, and that was the work of the infractors and the tormentors and the human chattel masters who managed the warband's logistics. I returned to the resonant abyss. I went to my quarters. I sat in the dim with the membranes doing what they always do, and I listened. The Doom Siren on my back was humming. It always hummed, a low-level vibration produced by the interaction of its components, the resonance crystals and amplification chambers, and power couplings, and, somewhere deep inside the housing, the tissue that had once been Draeven Korr. The heartbeat was still there, faint, steady, the last working part of the man who had built me to hear quiet things and had not lived long enough to listen. I could still hear Grethis Mund, not through the hull, not through the void, which carries nothing. What a noise Marine hears at that range is the echo the killing leaves in the immaterium, the residue of a hive city's death still turning over in the warp, like water settling after a stone. The dying sounds of a city, the settling of rubble, the structural groans of buildings that had not yet finished collapsing. And beneath that, if I strained, if I pushed my hearing to its absolute limit and filtered out every other frequency in the spectrum, I could find the drainage conduits, or where they had been. They had come down in the 8th hour, when the accumulated resonance of the cacophony assault exceeded the structural tolerance of the sub-level infrastructure. Everything inside them was under a few hundred tons of ferrocrete. And in that 8th hour, when sub-level 38 came down, I heard the song, the 4th time in 2 centuries. Less than 2 seconds, thinner than I remembered it, a single note threaded through the collapse of the level I was born under. The Dark Prince was paying attention. Something in the death of that hive had been worth Slaanesh's notice. I had spent 180 years starving for that sound, and it arrived exactly on schedule, and I have never worked out whether that was a reward or a joke, and I have decided not to try. I went down to the slave pens afterward. 11,000 survivors from Hive Dessicara, sorted and manifested and waiting for processing. I walked the length of the holding decks, and I listened to all of them, every voice, every breath, every half-formed sound a terrified human being makes when they do not know what is coming. None of them had the melody. They were upper hive. Administratum clerks, transit workers, cathedral staff, people whose families had never set foot in a loom press hall. The tune belonged to Factorum 19 and the districts that fed it, and Factorum 19 had been in the Western Industrial Sector, and the Western Industrial Sector had been my assignment. I had leveled it in the first 3 hours without knowing what I was standing on. The child was gone. The melody was gone. Not taken by the Imperium, not lost to time, not buried by anyone else's weapon. Mine. There is a rack in my quarters holding 400 and some cylinders. Every one of them contains the last sound a living thing made, harvested at the moment, compressed, sealed, kept. Merchants screaming, Sisters of Battle screaming, a Skitarii Alpha coming apart in 2 registers at once. I can take any of them off the rack and let it out into a room and hear it again exactly as it was. 400 deaths catalogued and retrievable and mine whenever I want them. I have no cylinder with a child humming 4 notes in a drainage conduit. It was not the kind of sound our equipment is built to take. You cannot harvest something that quiet. A 4-note tune hummed by workers in a hive city on a middling world in the Cruentus subsector. It exists in one place now, stored in the auditory cortex of a creature who can hear it perfectly and will never reproduce it. The vocal cords that might have hummed it were replaced in the first raid with organs designed to weaponize sound rather than make music. For 3 weeks he did nothing, and the reason he did nothing was Ren. You do not carry a report to a Lord Cacophonist in the fortnight after he has been made to look stupid in front of his own warband. Denunciations delivered to Ren in that condition tend to end with the denouncer opened up as well, on the general principle that anybody bringing him further irritation is part of the irritation. Talarn ran drills, maintained his blastmaster, took his place in the recitals, and waited for the Lord's temper to settle back into its usual shape. I watched him wait, and I told myself he had written it off as a tactical halt, a senior Disharmonist pausing to recalibrate. That was a comfortable thing to think, and I let myself think it for exactly as long as it lasted. I carry the last copy of my mother's song in a brain that can no longer sing it. Draeven Korr's heart beats inside a weapon mounted on my back. Everything loud gets quieter. Everything extreme becomes normal. Slaanesh gave me the song again on Grethis Mund, and it was 2 seconds long and it changed nothing, because that is the arrangement. That is what the Dark Prince is, and no quantity of dead will ever move the arrangement in my favor. That is my existence. That is the bargain. But the quiet things, the heartbeat, the melody, the whisper of metal cooling in the void, those do not fade. They sit where they are, small and constant and undiminished, and I cannot stop listening to them because they are the only things in 200 years of war that have kept their shape. The next campaign is in 3 days. Lord Wren has identified a target in the Vespera Drift, a void station housing a population of 600,000. His scouts report unusual acoustic properties in the station's architecture, resonance patterns that suggest pre-imperial construction, possibly Xenos in origin. He is excited. He wants to hear what the station sounds like when we take it apart. Tullern has requested a private audience with Wren. I heard him filing the request through 2 bulkheads and a sealed hatch, his voice carefully modulated, the words inaudible to anyone without my specific range of hearing. He did not specify the subject. He did not need to. Killing him took an afternoon to work out. Tullern carries a Blastmaster, and a Blastmaster's secondary amplification chamber has a structural resonance at 406 Hz, and if I open a duel at that frequency and hold it through the 3rd exchange, the chamber will fail inward rather than outward. It would take his auditory system with it. Nobody would examine it closely. Equipment failure in a sonic duel is the most ordinary death in this warband, and I have been senior Disharmonist for 70 years, and I have signed off on 11 of them. I have not done it. It is not mercy. I do not know whether I want to keep hearing. The dampener would close the small register, and the small register is where everything that hurts me lives. Draven's heart, 4 notes from a loom press hall, the sound of a child in a conduit I could have walked to in 9 minutes. Every noise marine in the Pallid Chord sleeps without those, and they seem better for it. If Tullern files, the decision gets made by somebody who does not have to weigh it, and I will not have to find out what I would have chosen. So I let him walk past me in the corridors, and I listen to his heart rate stay perfectly level, and I do nothing. And I tell myself I have not decided yet. I have decided. Doing nothing is the decision. I simply have not said it out loud, and this is the only place I am ever going to, because that is what this is. I am not talking to you. I am talking into a resonance crystal in the chirurgion's workshop, on a rack between 2 others. And when Necrolis is finished with me, he will file it under the serial number of whatever I become. So it should be said once, properly, for whoever pulls this. Vekkren Thoss, Disharmonist, Pallid Chord, taken out of Hive Dessicara on Grethis Mund at 14 years of age. That is where Draven put his. It is the one archive in this warband nobody censors, because nobody has ever thought it was worth censoring, and I am putting everything I can still hear into it while I can still hear it. I am aware of what is on this crystal. A senior Disharmonist admitting he stopped firing in an advance, worked out how to murder a squad member, and declined. Necrolis will handle it, and Necrolis will not listen to it, because he never listens to any of them. He records, he files. He has no more interest in the contents of his archive than a man has in the contents of his own fingernails. And the proof of that is that Draven's confession sat on an open rack for over a century, and the chirurgion walked past it every day of them. If Wren ever thinks to listen, he will have me opened for it. I have weighed that against what I lose if nobody ever listens, and it was not a long deliberation. Not so that anyone will save me. Nobody in the Pallid Chord has ever saved anybody. But there will be another one. In 50 years or 900, some noise marine will go through those racks looking for a maintenance log, and find this instead. And somewhere in the middle of it he will hear 4 notes that mean nothing to him, and for as long as he listens the tune will exist again. That is the whole of what I can do. It is not much. It is more than the melody has had since the 8th hour over Grethis Mund. I have calibrated my sonic blaster. I have tested my Doom Siren. The Word-Bearer's crystal is still seated in the housing where Necrolis set it, and on the Vespera drift I will bring my voice up to the pitch that opens it, and the air will split, and whatever comes through will do to 600,000 people what was done at Fennock's Reach. On my back, Draeven Korr's heart beats its slow, quiet rhythm, and I can feel it through the housing, a vibration so faint that no other Marine in the warband can detect it. I will carry him into battle again. I will scream through his throat again. I will play the instrument he spent 3 centuries building in the register he built it for. And the one man in this galaxy who wanted to hear it is inside the weapon and cannot. The killing will be loud, and it will be less than the last time, and the time after that will be less still. Eventually, there will be nothing left but the noise itself, meaningless and infinite, and the quiet things will finally go silent. But not yet. Not today. Today I can still hear them.